The camera's important, but understanding how to properly use it is the most important part. The ISO, aperture, and shutter speed are universal settings that will be in your camera no matter if you have a $100 point and shoot or a $30,000 cinema camera. So what are these things? Let's jump right in. Let's begin with the first aspect of the exposure triangle, the aperture. The easiest way to explain aperture is comparing it to the human eye. The larger the aperture is, the more light can come in, and the smaller the aperture is, the less light can come in. This is where it gets a little counterintuitive, but just bear with me. So the larger the number the f-stop is set to for the aperture, the smaller the opening in the lens is. This allows in less light. And vice versa, the smaller the f-stop, the larger the hole in the aperture is, in turn letting in more light. This also affects your depth of field. So what is depth of field? The smaller the aperture, the greater the depth of field. Conversely, a large aperture gives us a shallow area of focus of the size of the camera's aperture expressed in f-stops. By using a small aperture and a deep focus, we can clearly see the context around our character. On the opposite end of the spectrum is the large aperture, which creates a shallow depth of field. For example, a wide open aperture can be used to isolate the subject in a frame. ISO is used for the sensitivity of the camera's actual sensor, but aperture and shutter speed both physically control the amount of light let into the camera. Just for a little recap, the smaller the aperture is, the less light comes in, and the larger the aperture is, the more light comes in. And ISO controls how sensitive the camera's sensor is to the light that actually hits it. Lower ISO values makes the sensor less sensitive to light, making the image darker. A higher ISO value makes the sensor more sensitive to light, making the image brighter, and determines the exposure of the shot. Here's an example of me bumping up the ISO to make the image brighter. As you can see, as the ISO gets larger, the image begins to get brighter. Increasing ISO may help brighten up your shot, but there's always a catch. If your ISO is too high, your camera sensor will become too sensitive and will create noise and grain. But there is one last aspect involved, and that is the shutter. Light isn't the only thing the shutter speed affects. It also plays a big motion on how motion is captured. And not all motion looks the same. This is where we'll see the bigger differences between photography and cinematography. The shutter's job is to block light from the sensor. The shutter opens for a predetermined amount of time before shutting. This repeats many times a second. The amount of time that the shutter is open is known as the shutter speed, which is usually measured in a fraction of a second. So what are the two direct effects of shutter speed? They are the exposure and the motion blur. Let's talk about exposure. The slower the shutter, the longer the frame is exposed to light, resulting in a brighter image. The faster the shutter, the less light reaches the frame, resulting in a darker image. The most cinematic shutter speed for film and video is found using the 180-degree shutter rule. The 180-degree rule says that shutter speed should be double your frame rate. So what is frame rate? Remember when you were in school and you had those flip books that you would flip through the pages and it would make it look like it's moving? That's basically what video is. So following the 180-degree rule, if you're shooting at 24 frames per second, you have to double that, and that's your shutter speed. So you would have to shoot at 1/50th of a second. So if you're shooting at 60 frames per second, you double that, and you have to shoot at 1/25th of a second. Okay guys, I know that was a lot of information to digest, but this is the most important principle that you will carry with you through your entire career.